everyone, this is John Daly. I'm here with my co-host Thomas D. Howes for another episode of the Reagan Caucus Podcast. Today we have on a special guest to talk about the post-liberal movement and its connection with, among other people, Vice President J.D. Vance. He is an associate professor of politics at Ave Maria University. He is also a research fellow at the Center for Religion, Democracy, and Culture and a fellow at the Institute of Humane Ecology. I'm talking about James M. Patterson. James, thanks for joining the two of us today on the Reagan Caucus Podcast.
Happy to be here.
And James, you're going to be leaving Ave Maria to go somewhere else, right?
That's right. I'm headed to the Institute for American Civics at the Baker School. That's housed at the University of Tennessee.
And you're originally from Texas?
I am originally from Texas. That is correct.
So is it the case that all your exes live in Texas?
That's why I live in.
And
I'm not gonna subject the poor audience.
That's not the reason you're all hanging your hat in Tennessee. That's
Well, it's great having you on, James. I must admit, this is going to be an interesting topic. I must admit that the post-liberalism is a term and philosophy that really wasn't even on my radar until maybe 10 years ago max. And though it is certainly talked about a lot more now, I thought it would be a good idea before I hand things off to your old friend Thomas for some detailed questions. He'll ask you some detailed questions. I'm wondering, just sort of in general terms, can you describe to people what post-liberalism is?
Sure. And I would refer people for a more detailed answer to a Dispatch article I wrote exactly 1 year ago, maybe more like 9 months ago, but in August, in which I talk about post-liberalism. It has three components. As I explained in that article, first it's an attempt to adapt authoritarian ideology from Catholic reactionary movements after the French Revolution. People are very unfamiliar with this history, even in Europe. It's pretty obscure, but those who come from post-liberalism actually use that to their advantage. One of the funnier things about early on in the development of post-liberalism is people very frequently called them Marxists or communists. And what they were getting at was the authoritarianism. But what's funny is that so much of what informs contemporary post-liberalism is actually a totalitarian response against things like socialism. So they were trying to appropriate all of the authoritarian uses of power as instruments to resist communism. And that would mean that you had to pick a dictator, what Juan de Cortez says, a dictator of the sword instead of a dictator of the dagger. And was it? Did I say Juan? I forget if it's Jose or Juan. I'm sorry, guys. I'm in the process of moving, so I'm like losing track of my obscure post-liberal intellectual influences. Second is that it's a loose international coalition of right-wing parties and political actors. This often goes overlooked because of how much of the face for post-liberalism has been on social media. In fact, the fact that it's on social media has led a lot of people over a certain age not to take it that seriously, saying, well, it's mostly an online phenomenon, as if most things aren't also online phenomena now. The fact that post-liberal groups have formed institutions of considerable influence as well as taken over pre-existing ones doesn't seem to really register. There's a very strong post-liberal influence over Intercollegiate Studies Institute, or ISI. For example, most of the contributors to First Things these days have some kind of influence there, and these are kind of the older institutions, but they also have their own. There's Academia Tocqueville and Pro Civitate Dei in France, and there's it's a like Heiligenkreuz monastery in Austria that gets a lot of attention and produces a lot of figures of importance. But most important, of course, is Hungary, where post-liberals get a tremendous amount of resources and support through a man named Gladden Papin, who's one of the earliest adopters of Catholic integralism, which is sort of part of post-liberalism we can get into later.
It's hardcore post-liberalism, right?
Yeah, and he's the president of an organization there called the Hungarian Institute for International Affairs, which directly responds to Orban. So he's essentially like a American living in Hungary who's doing a lot of collaboration with lawmakers in the EU, especially right-wing lawmakers like Matteo Salvini in Italy and Marion Maréchal in France, as well as connecting with American lawmakers. And so he's been really important there. And the third is a set of policy proposals. And these policy proposals are meant to have some that are sweeteners for coalition partners in the conservative movement in the United States, and some that are like ultimate goals. And the sweeteners are things like, let's create a right-wing welfare state, where instead of individuals or particular categories of people are on the receiving end of federal welfare benefits, we're going to have families. And so we'll subsidize the American family by redistributing tax income. But they also have a broader sort of a mission, one of which is to withdraw the American polity from influencing world affairs. In other words, they're very strongly anti-interventionist. And another is that one of their ultimate goals would be to establish a confessional Christian state, specifically a Catholic one.
Well, great. That's, as I headed out earlier, Thomas is going to get in with some more detailed questions. I know the two of you know each other, so I'm going to tag him in for the first few. Go ahead and take it away, Thomas.
Yeah, so full disclosure to the audience, James and I are actually writing a book on post-liberalism, but because we're interviewing him, I'm just going to play stupid and just ask him questions about it, right? So James, you said that the Catholic integralists are like the hardcore wing of the sort of post-liberals, right?
Yeah.
Where would you say like this strand of post-liberalism, where does it get its start in the last few years?
So the best way to start with Catholic integralism is in a small Catholic liberal arts college called Thomas Aquinas College that is in the West Coast. And there was a particular cohort of people that are now in their 30s that all went there together, and among them, most famous of Catholic integralists is a Cistercian monk from an Austrian aristocratic family named Edmund Waldstein. Now, he becomes familiar with the work of a man named Thomas Pink, who is a philosopher in England who writes a revision of a Second Vatican Council. What is it? What would it be called? What's the official title?
The Declaration on Religious Freedom, Dignitatis Humanae.
Yeah, I know there are these words matter, like Declaration of Religious Freedom. And what Thomas Pink said is that Dignitatis Humanae doesn't mean what it looks like it means. It means the opposite. Specifically that religious liberty is a temporary concession, and when the church says it's grounded in human dignity, it's because the church, I guess, gets to decide what human dignity is. A very tenuous, very odd and radical misinterpretation of Dignitatis Humanae, but this was intriguing to the then much younger Waldstein and his cohort of people like Daniel Lemon, Josh Madden, Taylor O'Neill, who were sort of from that group and came to Ave Maria. This is how I know them and how I became familiar with Catholic integralism, because I was here too when they were graduate students here. Edmund Waldstein, I should point out, went to Austria. The others came here. And they decided to start developing this way of thinking about Catholic integralism that ties into pre-conciliar notions of church-state relations. And so the idea that Thomas Pink had was that the church actually has the indirect temporal authority over states, which is a kind of a lot of words to say that the church is actually sovereign over nations wherever there's an implication of the church. So states now, in order for them to be legitimate, had to refer to church teaching, And on the surface, this sounds good because, especially if you're a faithful Catholic, what this means is that there are all kinds of things that you have to observe. Like, if you're a faithful Catholic, you're not supposed to support abortion. So this would mean that states couldn't have abortion, except in very limited number of cases that the church would work out through priestly exceptions that they've devised. But the thrust of these theories actually goes in a different direction, which is, for example, as later authors on Catholic integralism, Alan Phimister and Thomas Crean, argue that you can't be a citizen unless you're a baptized Christian, in which case Jews and Muslims are considered sort of wards of the state, subject to their discretion for whatever is for the common good, which would mean the good that's set by the church. And this was why Waldstein, until he deleted his social media accounts, actually recommended not only that it was sort of acceptable to establish Jewish ghettos, but that it was actually a good idea because it limited the influence of Jews on politics. And this is one of the things about Catholic integralism, is that there's this preoccupation with exercising political dominion over others. Phimister and Crean also stipulate that if you're a baptized Christian not in communion with the church, so if you're Protestant Orthodox, you are subject to state penal action on behalf of the church in order to impose church discipline. So as it turns out, like, Catholic integralism is a source of considerable authoritarian impetus for these figures. So on the surface, what you think is like, oh, well, we'll get family-based welfare state and the end of abortion. What you actually get is, Jews living in ghettos and paying their taxes to build a cathedral.
So that's your hardcore integralism. How does that connect with the sort of more softcore post-liberalism that you get with somebody like Patrick Deneen? He wrote that book, Why Liberalism Failed. It was like 2017, right?
Yeah, in fact, a lot of what I've just described was very much obscure in 2015, 2016. When I first got here, it was 2016. It wasn't something that people talked about outside of incredibly niche Catholic intellectual traditions. And what did it was, what really changed things was the conversion of Adrian Vermeule to Catholicism and the publication of Why Liberalism Failed by Patrick Deneen. The reason why Adrian matters is that he's a chair professor of constitutional law at Harvard Law School. So he has this, very prestigious position, and is also a prolific tweeter, or prolific poster. It seems to be primarily his occupation is to give insane right-wing authoritarian tweets. And I would hate to be his RA. Anyway, but the other is Why Liberalism Failed, which was a book written by Patrick Deneen, who, having given up on peak oil conspiracy theories, decided to write a very silly, sometimes interesting, sometimes kind of excessive book, talking about how liberalism is this kind of like idea structured into the West. In the same way we might say, like, if you were on the left, racism is structured into, say, American institutions. He does the same thing, but with liberalism. So it's a critique, it's a structural critique from the right. So it's already kind of paranoid. And then he uses it as a way of describing how liberalism explains all social ills. So liberalism is the source for desires for people to corrupt their bodies with technology. So trans is liberalism, and it has to do with creations of economic inequality. So capitalism is the result of liberalism, and the worst form of capitalism, which of course in his view is the only one that will ultimately manifest. Like higher education's descent is the result of liberalism. as a menu of horribles, it's lengthy, and the way that he primarily argues this position is he attributes agency to the idea of liberalism. So liberalism sort of marches through the West as this kind of Geist, and structures our existence in such a way that we are nothing but helpless, isolated, alone, dissatisfied with our bodies, stimulated in our needs. And when you ask what liberalism means, it's like liberation from constraint. And anyone that he can associate with that idea and his own sort of creative imagination are like John Locke, John Adams, John Dewey, anyone named John, right? It's everyone, all right? Like John Daly.
Yes.
He goes from like Bacon and Novum Organum to John Dewey, and so what you end up with as for liberalism is an incredibly overly large concept, and its consequences are similarly overly large. And so this is what makes the book very hard and to take seriously. And it would have been a book that people would have been like, hey, you tried. But except Obama liked it. So Barack Obama put it on his end of the year book list. The next thing you know, Patrick Deneen goes from the guy who took the Notre Dame job from Peter Lawler to a schmuck that is like way in over his head for the argumentation that he needs to be doing in order to support this position.
Well, James, just to be, James doesn't hold back here. I would warn everybody. These people, a lot of them have, they've blocked James on social media. They've tried to
get him fired 3 times.
Yeah. So just so everyone knows that background. James doesn't talk this way about people normally. But just so then to clarify, liberalism isn't like what we think of when he's talking about liberalism. He's not talking about like Democrats. He's not talking about like Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, or something like that.
Although he does exploit that ambiguity, right? Mm-hmm. Like if he can get you to sign onto his project because you think liberalism means Nancy Pelosi, then he's happy to do that.
So he would say that like America was a mistake.
Yeah, there's a book of essays compiled shortly before Why Liberalism Failed came out called Conserving America, and the introductory essay to that, he says that America needs to be refounded because its liberal founding was a mistake. I don't know. I mean, great. Everyone has opinions.
So then, okay, so you have Deneen, and then you have these radical integralists, or integralists, depends who you ask. Both pronunciations I've heard.
Yeah, and I should have, just to add, I'm sorry, I've kind of lost track of the question. Someone like Deneen falls in with this crowd because he gets sort of linked up at a De Nicola Center conference at some point. I want to say it's the 2018 one or 2017, and Gladden Papin and Adrian Vermeule sit with him and Phil Munoz and try to like work out what the situation is with that. I think it's the same conference where Thomas Pink and Father Martin Ronheimer have it out over Dignitate Simone. And Deneen ultimately decides to throw in with Vermeule, although he's very cagey about how much he's done that. I don't know if he understands that he's not fooling anyone. But we know that the reason that he often tries to keep the more radical elements of post-liberalism kind of away from him is because I think it would do him professional harm. And this is why I joke around that the degree to which these people as post-liberals are Catholic integralists has a lot to do with that concern alone. So it's kind of like the Shia Muslim version of taqiyya, right, where you hide your genuine beliefs to preserve yourself until it becomes you become capable of being more honest about things. So I don't believe Deneen when he says that he's not a Catholic integralist. I just don't think he's capable of establishing that position, and the reason is because he's never explained why. He just says he isn't, but he doesn't say what it is that he doesn't particularly like. But he does say the things that he does.
Because I remember when Rod Dreher wants to sort of he works over in Hungary as a fellow at the Danube Institute, and he's kind of a post-liberal. But Rod Dreher is different from the other people in the group because he seems to have some sort of conscience. And no, but he came out one time.
Fully admitted as both a person who's Orthodox and whose father was a Freemason. I mean, these are issues that would really bother your Catholic integralist.
So he has expressed reservations about the integralism project in the past, and sometimes those guys, including Deneen, have pounced on him for it.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's two things that they're doing is that it gets attention for them to do that, right? It's an effective way of securing attention for their cause. The other thing that it does is it polices people that are supposed to be on that side. Deneen is very careful about policing these ideas, what criticisms of his position are acceptable and what aren't. And the thing about Rod Dreher is that he's one of these people who actually has his own independent audience. And so he poses a bit of a problem because he doesn't really have the same degree of dependence on this core group of post-liberals or Catholic integralists that work their way through Hungary. And other sort of organizations and funding operations. Dreher's an independent actor, and he's also, Dreher's also, he's a genuine person, and so he, however odd the things that he says can be, especially on social media, he doesn't seem to completely understand the game. Right. He thinks that we're supposed to have conversations and arguments. He doesn't see things as Deneen puts it, Machiavellian means to Aristotelian ends. He doesn't play that way.
Mm-hmm. So I want to get through a few people before we get to the predecessors of post-liberalism, the people that they're really drawing on. Vermeule writes a not famous, but for our niche of the world, famous review of Patrick Deneen's book, Why Liberalism Failed. You want to tell us about that?
Say the question again. I'm sorry, it cut out.
Sorry. Adrian Vermeule, he back after the when Patrick Deneen published his book, Why Liberalism Failed, Adrian Vermeule wrote a review of it. It was called Integration from Within, I believe.
Yeah, so this is the problem with Deneen's book from an integralist perspective, that the diagnostic elements are all correct as far as they're concerned. Someone like Adrian similarly views liberalism as a structural element that has conspirators that sort of build the structure into the West. Who those conspirators are, he is very forthright about. He refers to them as left liberals that are the radicals and right liberals who are their stooges, and these political actors he names and shames, and as well as prolifically blocks on social media. And he doesn't block them in text, but he's also very unashamed to do that in some of his writing. But what he writes in American Affairs is that Deneen gets the diagnosis right, but at the time that Deneen publishes Why Liberalism Failed, the aforementioned Rod Dreher was actually at the top of his game professionally, because he had written this book called The Benedict Option. And the Benedict Option is essentially an argument for strategic withdrawal from the secular world to rebuild the family, the church, the community, so that when everything collapses around us, there's something left to build with. And he gets the idea of Benedict starting a monastery at the time of the decline of the Western Roman Empire. Everything about this seems to be true for Vermeule, except he says that they're going to find you and they're going to destroy you. And so instead of having a flight response, you need to have a fight response. And so the way that you do that is by, as the title calls it, integration from within. And so the thing that Deneen misses, and sort of by sort of aligning himself with this Drarian passivity and withdrawal, Adrian insists that the battle must be met, and it must be met in Adrian's favorite thing in the world, which is the administrative state. And the administrative state is good for Adrian because what it does is it uses power directly, unaccountably, and with precision. So he likes the administrative state. He does not like traditional conservative opposition to it as unconstitutional. And the reason that he doesn't like that is both because he likes power as something that people can wield, and he doesn't particularly care for constitutions. And so what he wants Deneen to understand is that the political implications of his diagnosis are not withdraw, rather they're retrenchment and a return to battle. But what this then means is that the traditionally sort of American conservative inclination towards constitutional republicanism needs to be abolished and thrown into the dust heap. That's what he calls right liberalism. I described it earlier as being a stooge, right? All you do is slow down the left's attempt to destroy the proper political order and the common good. And Deneen seems to be persuaded by this, but the way that that Vermeulen explains this process, he explains at the Josias, which is this integralist blog and website, where he talks about two kinds of ralliement. And ralliement is Leo XIII's Pope Leo XIII's description of how French Catholics should respond to the French Third Republic, namely by participating in a political process rather than trying to stage like a coup. So his view of ralliement is no longer to form Catholic political parties like the way Charles Marat did, but instead to create an administrative state staffed by people taught by figures like Vermeulen and Deneen, and then subverting the state from within. So you integrate white-collar professional college graduates that are, sent through elite, prestigious universities, and rather than them believing Foucault and Derrida, they believe, I don't know, Louis Voulot and Carl Schmitt. And so this is the sense in which the left and the right actually become the same in every respect, except for which totalitarian ideology they want to impose.
So Vermeulen, he had a little bit of a background that was kind of leading up to this, right? Before his conversion to Catholicism.
He was the great defender of torture.
Yeah, so like during the Bush years, he was really into defending torture. That's right. And
Loved
really into
torture. Yeah, I thought it was great.
But really into defending also like he was very much a Cheney type person who believed in strong executive, who that, some of us more limited government types are uncomfortable with, or the constitutional conservatives are uncomfortable with, like a very strong executive, and he extends that to the administrative state. He basically wants the government to be run by a very strong administrative state. He sees things like representative aspects of our government, like Congress, as a burden, as a waste of time. He wrote a Washington Post article a few years ago about what if we didn't have Congress? I can't remember the exact title, but it was like, what if we didn't have Congress? And he basically said we'd be better off if we didn't have Congress. If we just had this sort of so people complain about the left being too much into like ruled by experts in the administrative state. Adrian Vermeulen is the right-wing version of that. Because he's an administrative lawyer by trade. Like he has administrative law.
Yeah, we're told that he's very good at it. I'm in no position to evaluate it. I don't know anything about administrative law except, the limited amount of reading I've done, which is primarily him and his bête noir Philip Hamburger, and there's zero light. There's zero overlap between them. So, but obviously, for all of his expertise on this sort of thing, he's definitely not similarly an expert over any of the other subjects we're talking about right now.
So James has to get his dig in So, okay.
Guy writes a
So,
book called Common Good Constitutionalism and never consults the theological or philosophical tradition of the common good except for what fits for his case. I'm not sure what else you want me to say, Thomas.
no, I'm, you know, um, so then there's okay. So Adrian Vermeule, he thinks basically capture the administrative state from within. So, okay, and then Deneen's second book, Regime Change, talks about how we're gonna use populism to put our own better elite in. Our elite,
Yeah.
basically us. He wants us to be the populism to lead to people like Deneen becoming the new elite in the right.
Yeah. So
Um,
Deneen's book, let's see, Regime Change. It doesn't make as much of a splash as Why Liberalism Failed, and I think that's because by now everyone's sort of used to these arguments.
mm-hmm.
What was the name of the Roman philosopher? I've suddenly forgotten the name of. Polybius. So, in Regime Change, he wants to establish an argument for Aristopopulism. And this means developing a greater degree of coordination between elites and the people they're supposed to represent. Now, this argument's not very original. This is actually the argument from progressives who wanted to have a revised version of the American Constitution that was less about sort of local government and republicanism and more about a kind of leadership, a term that doesn't get used a lot in the presidency. So this is how Deneen is essentially trying to bridge his own thinking with that of Deneen's, and the idea of Aristopopulism is also meant to figure out how you can take post-liberal ideology and coordinate it with this populist moment. And the problem is that a lot of the arguments that he makes in the book are a bit of a mess. I think trying to make sure I got this right, but he refers to Polybius as a figure here, and the idea of Polybius as a theorist of the Roman Empire before the Roman Empire existed, and so he was theorizing about something that was not yet around, and that's an odd mistake, and it points to the problem that Deneen often has, where he's all over the place and is too stuck in theory. And what you end up with being too stuck in theory is having to like paper over ideas. And in this case, my guess is that he just genuinely wasn't paying attention. Let's see, Polybius. One was
the other thing that was interesting about that book was, in Why Liberalism Failed, Deneen makes some comment that, you could probably have something like the American Constitution and without the liberal philosophy behind it. But in Regime Change, he actually challenges that. He says he opposes this notion of having that we should be committed to a separation of powers and checks and balances. He opposes all of that stuff too.
Which is a weird thing to oppose because that's kind of what Polybius liked.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is what I mean. Like, you have to understand, Deneen had this like surprise hit in his hands with Why Liberalism Failed, and there was an immediate demand for a sequel, and it I think was late. I don't know. This is what people told me, and it's hard for him to kind of push something out like that so quickly, given that he was flying to Hungary so often. That that we end up with a book that is it's even less capable of focusing on the problems that it's addressing and makes pretty fundamental errors. But the purpose is yet another theory of executive power centralized into a particular figure, and it's always kind of like the Trump that we would pray for, right? Like rather than it being like the real actual Donald Trump, It would be the Donald Trump that post-liberals would wield. And this gets into this kind of funny idea that you get in The Prince, right? That executive who can wield that kind of power, but should always listen to very good advisors, right? And so, us, right? You should listen to us. You should do what we tell you so that we don't have to be burned with ruling, but are capable of influencing outcomes.
I wanted to ask you a little bit more about that particular topic, if you don't mind me jumping in here, Thomas. But you mentioned before, or alluded to post-liberalism putting this emphasis on social conservatism. So it's sort of interesting to me that post-liberals have aligned themselves so closely with Donald Trump. A guy who is by no means a social conservative, even these days on policy. As we've seen him evolve on abortion, for example. I think
more
this
like
is what
revert, right? Like his pro-life position was always pretty much an artifice.
Right. Oh yeah, and I don't think it to heart. Yeah, it was ever. I think I suspect he's always been pro-choice. But are post-liberals just sort of fine, kind of overlooking who Trump is because they see a guy who doesn't have many principles or much of an ideology, and therefore he can be used to sort of eliminate, principles-based obstacles that are in their way, like classical liberalism or Reagan conservatism, as some call it. Is that sort of their view, do you think?
So, in the short term, for a while, they understood Trump to be such a disruptive figure that they had a relatively short timeline for what might happen. One among them, I won't say who it is, but if you know the story, you know immediately who I'm talking about. Because I wasn't a witness to this, but one of them apparently at an ISI event, with 100% seriousness, believed after seeing during the first term Donald Trump go to meet Pope Francis and Melania Trump behave according to protocol, that Trump would convert to Catholicism, suspend the Constitution, and be elevated king by Pope Francis. Doesn't sound like the Pope Francis we knew, but that was his belief. And of course, I'm not giving anything away by using the male pronoun because they're all male anyway. Curious. So when, Vermeule has a different view. Now it's obviously not him, but which is more long-term. And the post-liberal order that he was a Substack that he founded. He doesn't really write for it anymore. He's got something else that he writes for that I've forgotten. But he talks about this same idea of integration from within, but he calls it the problem of political imagination, which is that the most common opposition to post-liberalism or Catholic integralism is that it will never happen. And his response is more or less to say, well, if you told people in 1958 that we wouldn't have like a sexual revolution and that there wouldn't be gay rights and all these other things, they would have believed it too. They would, that this was all going to stay the same, right? But because of the long march across the institutions, the left was able to make massive changes to social policy, and what it took was essentially a generation. And so that is now the time frame with which I think people within the movement understand things. So, Trump is not going to become King Donald the First, with Barron as his heir apparent, our massive heir, Prince of Washington, right? Like 7 feet tall. But instead, what they see themselves as doing is making necessary concessions to coalition partners that will keep them at the table. So, their chief advocate and a source of influence is Vice President J.D. Vance, and J.D. Vance will say things like, I don't kiss the ring of the Pope, IVF, sure, let's federally fund that. Like all these things that are openly contrary to the stated Catholic positions that they hold to. And the reason is because, again, Machiavellian means to Aristotelian ends. This is what Deneen says. It doesn't matter these concessions you make now, because the point is for Vance to be president next. And so if that means giving lip service to a policy that's not going to go through, or insulting a head of state who's victimized, whose people have been victimized by the Russians for several years. He'll do it, whatever it takes. And this is, as in Thomas's book, in my book, this is straight out of the playbook of Catholic integralist and Catholic action parties and political Catholicism generally. They made all kinds of friends with fascists.
Yeah. So going off, you brought in Ukraine about this. So J.D. Vance, I've heard him argue many times that if we just stopped, funding Ukraine against Russia, then we could fix Social Security or better help out, American hurricane victims or whatever. In reality, and I think most people understand this, but maybe not. Ukraine is this, tiny little expenditure for the United States, and if that expenditure suddenly went away, no domestic problems would be fixed or even addressed as a result. Certainly not entitlement spending, Social Security. But with the post-liberalism ideology could perhaps, I think that the ideology could explain that mindset. But do you think Vance and others who make these arguments actually believe anything that they're saying, or do they just view it as this useful demagoguery that works on some people? And I think it does work on some people. I see it with Facebook friends who have adopted this position. Do you think that he believes in any of this, or do you think it's just, like you said, the long game? This is just something we can put there up in societal discourse and hope it really takes hold? Well,
I don't know J.D. Vance. He and I are not buddies. I don't think that's probably ever going to happen. Right. But the thing about saying these things is that as you say them, you begin to believe them, because people don't actually work like Cobra Commander in G.I. Joe, or like your average villain in Game of Thrones, right? Like, it's what I think he believes what he says. How does this work with the idea of portraying yourself as this Machiavellian means to Aristotelian ends? Is that's just the cover for the things that they actually want to do, right? But they believe it earnestly that this is how things must be done. You cannot engage in what they describe as neutral proceduralism, right? Which is what we also call the Western legal tradition. The reason for that is that that's the game liberals play to get you to do things like make compromises on core values. Instead, what you need to do is suspend those laws and then make compromises on core values like IVF. But this time is different because they're the ones making the compromises, and they're the ones who are, those with the right ideas about how to govern. They're sort of that's how they see it. In the short term, making these kinds of concessions might be something that they regret, but because they believe that they're establishing a new political order, it's worth it. And so they won't necessarily think that it's the best thing in the world for these IVF subsidies. But oddly enough, despite the fact that they believe that conservatism never conserved anything, in this case, they're doing the same concessions that they would attribute to, like, I don't know, Mitt Romney, over, things like healthcare spending. What matters is that someone like Mitt Romney does not have the same vision as them to implement when the IVF spending will go away and everyone will be forced to convert. That's a slight exaggeration, by the way. I've been using a lot of dry sarcasm in this interview.
I love it.
And I'm pretty sure I'm going to get a lot of lawsuits.
That's all right.
Yes.
Well, I'll just interrupt you, Thomas. I'll throw it back to you. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. So I was just gonna say, so J.D. Vance is kind of like, based on, if you follow these post-liberals on social media, now Elon Musk makes it so that we can actually read their posts, even though they block us. And if you read their blogs, like Gladden Papin's blog, or Substack, whatever you call it, they were all excited about President Trump being elected, and they were, Glenn and Papin said something like, "We've been training loyalists for 4 years now, so now we can have our new post-liberal order." Right?
This isn't an exaggeration, of course. People at ISI Honors College that have gone through Deneen and Chad Pecknold's process, they have allies over in American Moment, which was founded for the same reason. When he's saying that, he's not, kidding. He's
yeah, no, right. So they've been contributing to this effort to sort of train loyalists, but there is some within the sort of coalition of intellectual influences at the top, right? With Trump being the one who's the most pragmatic of them all, and everyone else just trying to convince him. J.D. Vance is almost sort of a hinge point for these coalitions, right? So he's calls himself a post-liberal. He endorsed Deneen's book, Regime Change. He was a convert to Catholicism around the time that this stuff started becoming popular. He was sort of brought in, I don't know, get into that, but sort of brought in, the people he was around when he came into the church were all these post-liberals. You could find all these pictures of him with his buddies, and they're all like post-liberals, like
Chad is, got as his banner picture him with Deneen and Vance, when I think Vance was running for Senate, maybe a little before that.
So they're all buddies with him. But he's also worked for Peter Thiel. Mm-hmm. Is it Thiel? Peter Thiel, and says that Curtis Yarvin is a big influence on him as well. So there seems to be this sort of weird sort of marriage confluence of goals between the post-liberals and the sort of Curtis Yarvin libertarians.
Like paleo-libertarian ideas, right?
Yeah, sort of like anarcho-feudal.
The king as CEO.
Who's going to give us more liberty, right? It's like what's that guy's name? You guys ever heard of him? Hans Hermann Hoppe.
Oh yeah.
So he was one of the influences of Curtis Yarvin. These sort of anarcho-feudalists, right?
Yeah.
But what do you think the sort of common interest that brings those sides together is? I mean, what do they have in common?
So what they have in common is that they were all ways of thinking about right-wing politics that conventional conservatives in the United States kick to the curb. So I remember when he was Mencius Moldbug, I read his stuff like 10 years ago. I kept, have you ever had this experience where you're reading something, someone's been very enthusiastic about it, and you're like, what am I not seeing?
Yeah.
Like, what am I not getting? And it took me like a couple days of just going through all of his junk and just being like, oh, there's nothing here. This isn't my problem. This is his problem. And I don't know why people like this stuff, right? Mm-hmm. So people like him are Curtis Yarvin, attractive to a certain kind of person who has no idea how politics works, right? But they do know, for example, how like starting a business or running a business works. And so what he does is he repeats back to them the way that a business works and then says this is how government should work. And so, of course, in a business, employees have the right of exit, but very little else in most cases. And so this would, when mapped on, and as an analogy onto being an American citizen, would be like, if you can escape, right? Like you have freedom, right? Like that's almost what Hobbes says, right? Like the freedom of the subject is the limits of the ability of the state to find you and punish you. This view is, of course, has very little in common in some ways with the post-liberal position. But what it does have is an opposition to the Constitution. It doesn't like representative government. It has no patience for civil society as creating informal solutions to problems that we normally associate with the administrative state. So what are frequently mocked by this new right organization as little platoons. This is a term that comes from Tocqueville. And they're like, no, we need big platoons of administrative agents that are going to know what's best for you in the spirit of Aristopopulism. And so what post-liberals have in common with this is they also don't like the Constitution. They don't like representative government. They don't particularly like civic associations that are not directly affirmed by the church. So there's a lot for them to get along with. They, post-liberals are big fans of corporatism and limits on trade. One of the things that's a big part of post-liberal economic ideas is, well, you don't want too much economic growth, right? Deneen says this is why liberalism failed. It's and other of these people that, if you have too much economic growth, you end up with a corrupt people, right? So they really do only need two dolls, and it's good for the soul for you to work in a steel mill instead of in an office. There's a lot of very, very, deeply ironic condemnations of email jobs by people like Sohrab Ahmari, who I don't think has lifted a hammer on purpose in his entire life. These actually do have a fair amount of overlap. Plus, each of these organizations have their own sponsors. And so they need to find a way of getting together and getting along. Thiel was originally a sponsor of national conservatism. And, as it happens, Yoram Hazony, who's kind of been relegated to the margins of his own movement at this point, was actually just college buddies with Patrick Deneen. So Deneen gets brought in at the first NatCon conference, gives a non-endorsement of national conservatism. And there's this kind of like frenemy relationship between post-liberals and national conservatism where like Gladden Papin is, going, but also complaining about it. That's significant because, of course, when national conservative goes to Europe, the chief sponsor is Hungary. And that's the same patron that Gladden Papin has. So Orban brings to the table a lot of resources, which means that you want to have them in your coalition because it's better to keep them close than to keep them farther away as critics like they were during the buildup of this kind of coalition. So, you have Klingenstein and Claremont and, left-wing organizations like Amadar and Hewlett funding this stuff. And so another reason why they end up all kind of together is because everyone's trying to fund into existence a counter conservatism to replace what was built during the 60s with Buckley and Frank Meyer and the like. And I'm not sure if it's going to be permanent or if it can be held together, but that's the idea. One final note, and I've said this already once, is of course that they are also opposed to progressives. And so just like when Catholic integralists and like Argentina and France, not France, but Croatia, these places, they would make, common cause with pretty unsavory groups. You have the same thing here where they have at least the same enemy. And so they might as well work together even if they have different visions of what the country should ultimately be.
So it sounds like they agreed to just tear the whole thing down, and they all hope that they end up themselves persuading the strong man to do their things. Right.
Yeah, let me give you an example. Getulio Vargas in Brazil became a dictator. Brazil was, a hot mess during the interwar years. It kind of still is, but.
And this was at the first half of the 20th century.
Yeah, this is the 1930s, the largest right-wing party was a group called Brazilian Integralist Action. It was run by a guy named Plinio Salgado, and his movement was this weird mix of like native language embracing ideas, but it was very Catholic influence too. And Salgado goes to Italy and meets with Mussolini, and Mussolini starts to receive subsidies to influence the politics of Brazil. And Salgado, as a result, rather than challenging Vargas, actually tries to become the most important supporter of Vargas so that Salgado can then have a seat at the table in Vargas's government. And Vargas promises him and the Brazilian Integralist Action Party a control over things like education and social policy. And as a result, wins over their favor and then completely screws them. right? Like it kicks them to the curb when he doesn't need them anymore.
Mm-hmm.
But even like assuming that Vargas was not going to do that, that is how you can end up with a coalition working this way. It's the same way, in a weird way, that conservatives worked when they were normal. And so it's like, look, we'll leave the libertarians to economic policy. We want to ask them to legalize cocaine. That would be bad, right? And so of course, the coalition partner that ended up getting kind of the worst end of that deal was social conservatives, because they didn't get Roe versus Wade overturned in the 80s and 90s. They didn't prevent same-sex marriage from being affirmed. And so this is actually sort of the ground that's laid for the post-liberal challenge to conservatism, is its failure on social policies, but what wins things like the Cold War and free trade.
So that's one of the things that you talk about in the book, is this whole history of previous attempts at something like post-liberalism, and how they always, surprisingly, have some chair, proximity to power a lot of times, which is crazy because there's so few of them, right? They're just
right.
They punch above their weight in a certain sense, but as soon as they sort of claw their way to the top to this coalition with other authoritarians, you're saying they're kind of like, it's like the anarchists are the first ones to to get shot after the revolution.
Right.
They're kind of like the first ones to get kicked to the curb after the revolution, right?
A lot of what I call throughout the book either historical post-liberals or clerical fascists. They're really the same thing, and I have to kind of figure that out before we publish this book in 2039. But those of you who don't know, the book is also a year late, and it's my fault. So I'm like bagging on Deneen for this, not getting his book out, and it's like, well, look in the mirror, buddy. But Thomas has been done for months. Anyway,
you ended up having much more challenging chapters than I did.
Yeah, and this question is the reason why. By training, I'm what's called an Americanist. I do American institutions and political development. I have very little knowledge of things like Brazil and Argentina in the interwar years going into this project that I've now had to fix. And so Argentina, Brazil, Portugal, and Belgium are each countries with Catholic majorities that have integralist parties with like a kind of post-liberal ralliement kind of approach to influencing politics emerge. And these governments managed to prevent them from securing control. And the reasons have to do with dictatorships using them as a source for public support, but either those groups becoming also a liability to the point where they cut them loose, or a potential challenger. In the case of Salgado, for example, after he got cut loose by Vargas, there's actually a coup attempt that Brazilian integralist action takes on. And to read about it is kind of hilarious because they all go to the presidential palace to begin the coup, and some guy with the van with a bunch of ammunition drives off and never to be seen again. So they end up with half the ammo they need, and nobody knows what they're doing. But even then, they still almost succeeded in establishing an integralist coup because Vargas' dictatorship was equally incompetent. But in the case of Argentina, Ramirez, the prime minister, and then Juan Perón don't know what to do with these guys. They're constantly writing about Jews and Masons undermining the country. A lot of people think that they're kind of crazy. In the case of Argentina, they're getting a huge amount of pressure from the American government to just to start supporting the Allies with their exports. And so people like Hugo Vost and Julio Mainville are sent packing. Eventually, I think Julio Mainville is who's a priest. I think he's laicized for calling a later Argentine president a communist. These people are all kind of figured out to be crazy at some point. And Hugo Vost writes like a novelization of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Like there are a lot of these people are pretty creepy. And then there's another group of countries where integralists succeed, but they don't really succeed on their own. They always succeed in coalitions. So like in Austria, there's the group called the Christian Socials. They joined with the church in trying to secure Austria, which is basically a failed state in the 1930s. And the way that they do that is by merging with a group called the Heimwehr, which was a right-wing paramilitary group, more or less like a pro-Austrian, anti-Nazi fascist paramilitary group. And they unite under the Fatherland Front under Engelbert Dollfuss. And then immediately they're fighting, right? They're fighting over clout and influence. Same thing happens with Franco. He creates this extremely lengthy named coalition of the Traditionalist Party and the Phalange. Phalange were fascists, Traditionalists were integralists. And they immediately start fighting internally over these options. This pattern repeats, and there's only one where it doesn't happen that much, and that's in Croatia. And the reason is because everyone in Croatia agreed that they had to kill as many Serbs as they could, and this meant that all problems could be solved by just killing more Serbs, sending more Jews to the camps, and sending more Roma to the camps. That was much more of like a terrorist, like a kind of Catholic Taliban called the Ustachi. But in most cases where even the very basics of government functioned, there were coalition partners that had to hash things out. And so this is a pattern we've seen before. And because post-liberalism as an idea is not all that popular, America doesn't have a very large, number of people that'd be interested. And Vermeule's solution is to, integrate from within, take over the administrative states, and make people fans of post-liberalism and integralism by administering it in a way that works for them, as long as they don't mind their freedoms being taken away.
Yeah, so that's so we've seen that in the post-liberals themselves connect themselves to these prior authoritarians as well. Vermeule will cite Carl Schmitt, the sort of monarchist turned integralist turned Nazi.
The crown jurist of Nazi jurisprudence.
Yes, exactly.
Louis Boulot, he cites, who was a monarchist in France and a pretty nasty anti-Semite.
Juan Donoso Cortez, who was not an anti-Semite, but he was in favor of dictatorship.
Yeah, like I said, he's the guy who came up with the choice between the dictatorship of the saber versus the dictatorship of the dagger. The dagger being the socialist. Right. Cortez really hated Proudhon.
And then the people that were closer to the French Revolution, sort of the big reactionaries of 19th century reactionary
Louis Bonald and Abbé Borel and Joseph de Maistre. Yeah,
Joseph de Maistre. And you said Bilot, right?
I said Bonald. Bilot is later.
Bilot. Yeah. Sorry. Bonald. Right. And Bonald was like sometimes people call him the father of modern anti-Semitism.
Yeah, he writes an 1806 article in Mercury called Sur les Juifs, and it's all about how the Alsatian Jews impoverished the right and honorable Catholic aristocracy in the area and we're going to use that as leverage to impoverish the rest of the country and place it in the hands of international Jewry.
Yeah, so the current post-liberals tend to not be anti-Semites. They
recommend you read Bonald, like Janine did, to none other than Bishop Robert Perrin, who did not, I think, know that that's what Bonald argued. Just sort of nods.
Well, anti-Semitism was sort of central to their argument because they were saying that it was the liberation of the Jewish people that is one of the reasons that we've had these problems, right?
So yeah, I mean, like, this is really in the weed stuff, but it's in the book. One of the problems that defenders of throne and altar in France needed to deal with was the fact that a lot of people really hated the throne and altar. Mm-hmm. And that the revolution was actually something a lot of regular French people welcomed because they had absentee aristocrats in Versailles peeing in stairwells because there were no toilets, and being humiliated by the king. And there were all of these second and third sons who didn't know Latin, didn't do the mass, and ignored all of their obligations as priests. And then they would become cardinals and go select, popes. It was all kind of like really unpleasant, right? Like,
like the Jewish people, they weren't emancipated. They didn't have full citizenship until that time.
Exactly. They lived in ghettos and were serially mistreated. I mean, this is an ancient problem in France. It goes back to St. Louis IX burning all the Talmuds, and lots of bad stuff goes on in France. And, one of the things the French revolutionaries do in the early days of the revolution is they emancipate the Jews and make them full citizens of France. And this combined with the rising influence of the Freemasons as a civic institution in France, where local merchants, wealthy merchants, could sort of rub elbows with aristocrats that built social capital within these networks. They then sort of like these outside theorists of the time, sort of the counter-revolutionary theorists, are like, oh, no. So this whole thing was like a Jewish and Masonic plot, and the whole reason that you hated the king and the church wasn't because that they were doing anything wrong. It's because you were told lies by Jews and Masons.
Yeah.
And the connection between the lodge and the Jews was that the Jews invented the lodge to seduce evil Gentiles into doing the Jewish bidding. And this all comes out of a combination of Abbé Barrel's memoirs on Jacobinism, it's something called the Simony letter, which is a letter that attributes Masonry that Barrel blames the French Revolution on, and tries to connect it to Jews. Barrel has it in his hands and doesn't know what to do with it, and eventually he publishes it posthumously, I think. And then that's what leads the connection with Bonald's argument about the Jews being responsible for the revolution. And so that linkage then reaches full flower in people like Louis Voulot and and Charles Marat, all these other figures that post-liberals strangely recommend us to read.
Yeah, because I mean, they just I don't think they appreciate that how much that conspiracy theory played into this reactionary politics of that time. But nowadays, they kind of they aren't anti-Semite, most of them. So sometimes that international conspiracy gets filled in with like the globalists or something, right?
Yeah. So here's the problem. I want people to take seriously some of the responses we've had to J.D. Vance explaining why he didn't kiss the ring to Pope Leo XIV's ring to Ross Douthat in an interview. If you look that up, you're going online, and people are like, well, it's just online. It's like, hey, guys, guess where all political discourse is now? And what you'll find is there's a lot of reels, there's a lot of memes, there's a lot of posts of J.D. Vance doing that, explaining that, and then what is the next post? You know what it is? It's J.D. Vance at the Wailing Wall wearing a kippah. So the thing is that these guys, these post-liberals, they don't say anti-Semitic things. They recommend authors that were anti-Semitic. And then there's a lot of people who are influenced by them that are really, really anti-Semitic.
Oh, that's like the Groypers and all of those.
Yeah,
traditionalists.
Yeah, to the point where J.D. Vance does something like this, and people saw that he went to the Wailing Wall and prayed there, and they will use that to say that J.D. Vance ultimately had to capitulate to his Jewish masters. And this is definitionally how things like dog whistles work, right? Where you don't believe something, you say something that people understand to be what you think is like a high level intellectual critique, and what a large number of people who are working underneath you will see differently. And the problem is they don't do anything about it. So if you are a post-liberal leader like Deneen or Pecknold or any of these guys, why aren't you defending the rights of Jews? Why aren't you condemning anti-Semitism? Well, that should be your first thing that you're doing, especially since we had, a terrorist attack at an Israeli on Israelis at a Jewish history in D.C. And so, what I would like to see is this, and this isn't the first time I've said this. I wrote a review of Kevin Valyer's magnificent book on integralism for CRCD, in which I said this, and yet there's none forthcoming, and it's very, very troubling to me.
Well, I think Sorab is the exception. I think Sorab Amari has spoken out against some of the anti-Semitism in trad circles.
Yeah, that's true. But
that's the exception.
He's also not really as much associated with them anymore. He's more of like
Social Democrat.
Yeah, he's more of a social democrat now, and works for. It doesn't even work for his own magazine.
Yeah,
Compact.
he dropped it. Yeah.
So I don't think that's good enough.
Yeah. So the last thing I just wanted to point out is our book that we're writing together is called Why Postliberalism Failed, and people are like, sometimes people say, hey, look, we didn't fail, we got J.D. Vance in the White House, right? It's like, yeah, but you had to give up everything you really cared about up to this point. I mean, now there's one of these post-liberals wrote an article in a Substack like a few months ago where he said he was going through the history of the post-liberal movement from the integralists and Deneen, and they basically said, well, we don't really care about the integralism part anymore because that's not popular with the other people in the movement. But
where is this? I have not read this.
Oh, that was Pinkowski, his Substack.
Oh,
and then he gets to like,
that's why I don't.
But now we have this post-liberal order that puts an end to mass immigration and all these things.
Yeah, it's just racist now.
Yeah, it's like what you guys. I mean, because when you go back to Why Liberalism Failed, remember, the strength of the book is that he doesn't offer any counter alternative. He just says at the end, we go back to our local communities and allow something better to organically emerge. And everyone's like, oh, good, I like that.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's explicitly anti-ideological, right? He says that one thing that won't work is ideology. And next thing you know, he's like, psych, post-liberalism. We're going to talk about that now.
Yeah. But now, because of the reality of politics, all they have now is anti-immigration, which is funny because it's not even clear that that's traditional Catholic position to be anti-immigration.
And it's also not what Vermeule argues in his like rather famous post at Mirror of Justice about creating a immigration policy that only lets in Catholics.
Yeah, because he wants to create the Empire of Guadalupe, he called it.
Yeah, the Empire of Our Lady of Guadalupe. It was that was something else. I don't know to the degree to which Nathan actually speaks for any of these guys.
Yeah.
He wants to have the same amount of influence as they do, but he's got a Substack. That's it, right? And he writes for Compact and First Things. And his preoccupation with immigration is longstanding. Like he gave I can't remember, it was 22. He was at NatCon and he advocated for a kind of strategic Gallicanism against Pope Francis because he was so pro-immigration, and he opened that. It's actually published, like Decline of the West at First Things. It's a talk that he gave, and he opens with this celebration of Jean Raspail's Camp of the Saints.
Yeah.
Which is a pretty reprehensible book.
Yeah.
I don't know. At this point, we're looking at people who are post-liberal, but they're post-liberal in the same way that, like, the Federalists were Federalists, right? John Adams and Alexander Hamilton really varied quite widely on a lot of things.
Yeah.
So Nathan Pekoski, because he's such a fan of Charles Marat, as he has already sort of illustrated.
Charles Marat being the sort of French leader of Action Française, which was like a sort of a proto-fascist organization.
Yeah, and for Marat, you had to sort of like reject the four groups. There were four groups that he saw as threatening to France. The first were the Jews, the seconds were the Freemasons, the thirds were the immigrants and the and foreigners, and the fourth I can't remember. Okay. I'm sorry, I've been talking for a long time.
Oh no, it's okay.
At the same talk, I was there at the talk. He actually talks about the Freemasons in France as like a major political threat, which was, I remember like looking over at a particular Catholic writer with my eyes wide open, and she met me my stare like, oh, James, got another one.
So the conspiracism is alive in a lot of these people, you think?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And I joked
even
with
if they aren't...
Pekoski after his talk. I said, a lot of the Gallicans that you're celebrating that were part of the the Bourbon court before the Revolution were also Freemasons, right? So you have to choose.
Yeah.
But more seriously, like the thing about Marat is that he wanted to use enemies to concentrate and consolidate alliances. And so for Marat, the strategy of blaming foreigners was very useful, and that seems to be what Minkowski's arguing for a positive vision of, the Empire Guadalupe alienates more than it wins, and so instead let's just complain about foreigners unless they're white South Africans.
Okay.
I think James, a lot of people may not know this, but James has had a very long day, and he's been very generous with his time. I'm thinking that might be a good place to wrap things up.
I just have one question for James. One last question.
Yes, go ahead.
What is the most realistic, or what's the best realistic outcome from a standpoint of a post-liberal with J.D. Vance and everything going forward?
J.D. Vance wins election and tries to push a family subsidization program like that of Hungary's public policy, as well as using sort of liberal language of religious liberty to start funding social and religious institutions.
Okay, so they're going to tear down the Constitution, and that's the best hope for them.
Well, they'll get to hang out in the White House, and that's really worth it for.
Well, on that cheery note,
this is what happens when I get interviewed in the evening after moving. I'm a bit spicier than usual.
Yes, exactly. No, we enjoyed it very much, James, and I want to thank you for coming on the Reagan Caucus Podcast. I think listeners will find this very informational, very helpful. I for one, always enjoy the dry takes, the dry sense of humor. So I particularly appreciate having you on. And I also want to thank everybody, and we'd love to have you back on sometime. I also want to thank everybody who's watching for tuning in. If you watch today's episode on YouTube, make sure to like the video and subscribe to our channel. If you're listening to us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or some other audio platform, make sure you like and subscribe as well there. We appreciate that. It helps get our voices out to other people, and helps us bring on great guests like James. So James and Thomas, good luck on the book. We can put something about it in the show notes for sure, so people can know what to look for. And I want to thank you for coming on the Reagan Caucus Podcast.
Thank you so much.